Hello everyone, this is CM Kosemen again. Today we're gonna speak about something which hasn't really been noticed before, but I think you will all find it interesting. So, in this day and age, there's a lot of narratives dealing with a hero's battle with a constant stream of monsters. In games like Dungeons and Dragons, in lots of movies, including King Kong, which I reviewed and taught and pondered upon in an earlier podcast, and in video games and many other things. I think we have a cultural need to invent monsters, and it's just really cool to investigate all these stories, especially if they come from a very distant past and from what one might call legends. So today I will be quoting to you mostly from this one book about Alexander the Great, A Life in Legend by a certain Richard Stoneman. The book is a semi-academic, very rigorous study of a phenomenon known as the Alexander Romance. The Alexander Romance, of course, Alexander the Great was a kind of legendary, heroic person. He probably did more to affect our current history than any other leader, prophet, or heroic figure. It's just, when you look at it, so much depends on Alexander's conquests of Asia and the resulting blowback and the spread of basically a proto-Western culture across Eurasia. So yeah, Alexander was a very cool guy, and there's also a very nice Alexander the Great Iron Maiden song. Okay. Anyways, he was of course such a badass and legendary guy that, especially in the times when there was no internet or modern communications or not even printing presses, he inspired a lot of legends, especially in Europe. And several books, probably authored by someone who was pretending to be Megasthenes, a guy who was with Alexander back in the day. So several books exist in many different cultures, in European, Islamic, even Jewish cultures. And these in totality are called the Alexandrian Romance or the Alexander Romance. And these books date from anywhere between the 4th to the 16th centuries. And of course, in these stories, it's not about history, but it's a kind of my favorite sort of dream history in which real people and completely fantastical elements are all muddled together. In some way, they resemble the movies and comics and other pop culture products of today. In others, they are completely unlike anything that we do and produce in this day and age. So yeah, Alexander Romance. I just remembered what an awesome book this is, and I just wanted to relate this with this kind of monster narratives that we so much like to hear. So in these books, Alexander does a lot of things which are completely out of his time and place. For example, he goes to the bottom of the sea in a kind of diving bell that he builds, and he encounters strange fish and sea monsters there. He also takes griffins and ties them to his throne and kind of builds a flying machine. And then there's things like, he meets this superb oriental babes and has these traumatic romances with them, and they echo down even to this day, which we'll all get to talk about. So let's go on. But of course, before Alexander, the distant east, I'm talking about India and East Asia here, was always peopled by and populated by all kinds of monsters, And for example, everyone knows this sort of monstrous races, but when you look at the actual nitty-gritty of history, there are some far more underrated and badass legends out there. So before these Alexander romance stories, people were already telling tall tales about Asia and its secrets. And the most extensive account we have is by a certain Ctesias of Cnidus, which is actually a town in the Turkish Aegean, a beautiful place, a bit of a tourist attraction these days. You go to this historical, amazing city, and there you got a restaurant showing Premier League football matches to these kind of very banal types of tourists with iPads. But anyway, let's not get carried away. Ctesias of Cnidus, starts his accounts of India very modestly. He describes the river Indus, says how long it is, whatever. And he then talks about elephants and monkeys. And then what I like most about his narrative is that slowly he goes into this kind of from a plausible into a complete monster madness territory. So you got elephants and monkeys in India, which is okay. Then you got things like giant cockerels. And then you got parrots, which speak Indian language like a human being. But if it learns Greek, then it speaks that as well. Obviously, okay, nothing so extraordinary there, except for the giant cockerels maybe. Then he describes the spitting cobra, which was a really unique thing for the antique era. And then he describes something called the Indian reed, which probably seems to be a banyan tree, but could also be a bamboo, Then there are dogs that are big enough to fight lions. So there you're going kind of crazy. But even that is not really extraordinary. I mean, you got dogs like this. Then you got the Manticore, or the Manticora, which it says is the size of a lion, has an almost human face, human ears, and 3 rows of teeth, while its tail is loaded with numerous stings that it can fire at its enemies. So like, and the Manticore is still a fabulous beast, but of course, okay, it's a Google search away. I mean, it's not something completely novel. But what I find really cool about this is that it's got little counterintuitive details. So like this 3 rows of teeth, or the sting-loaded tail. So it's not just an animal hybrid, but it's a kind of working hybrid with little unexpected details that crop up and confuse us. And of course, what could the Manticore be in real life? What could it be inspired by? I always used to think this is like a corruption of the leopard or something, or maybe the cheetah that kind of looks like it has a flatter face than most cats, but we really don't know. But then Ctesias goes on to describe the human races in India, and then it starts to really get wild. So, of course, there's pygmies with long hair and beards down to the ground, who tend flocks and herds of a similarly pygmy stature. So you got like a race of hairy gnomes tending a herd of basically guinea pig-sized sheep. These pygmies recall one of the myths of Orang Pendek or many other legends of little man that people report even now from Eastern Asia, but once again, they could just be monkeys. People hadn't really seen monkeys in Europe or the Mediterranean world, and they could be taken for little people, especially if you consider the kind of Chinese whispers distortion effect that these word of mouth legends have. Then he describes a race of people for which we can find no analogy except in the world of sex dolls, because he says beyond these there are men with they exclusively live on milk. They have no anuses, and their buttocks are joined together, so that instead of defecating, they induce vomiting each evening to remove waste from their stomachs. Wow. Okay, this is supremely interesting because it's obviously a tall tale, but a person with a one-way digestive system and no anuses, did he go down and check? One wonders. Then he describes the others, the dog-headed man whose language consists of barking, which can also understand Indian tongues and which probably were a distortion of baboons or langurs or other strange monkeys. But these dog-headed men persisted for so long in the West, especially from in the most distant regions of the West. In Ireland or places like this, you get several dog-headed saints, for example, which are really strange. They are like revived versions of these dog-headed gods in ancient pantheons and so on and so forth. And then he says, in the Indian mountains, where the reeds grow, so where probably bamboo or banyan trees grow, there's a race of men who up to the age of 30 have white hair all over their bodies, but then it begins to darken until at the age of 60 it's entirely black. Their ears are long enough to cover their arms and backs, and they could cover themselves with their ears when sleeping. So there's another amazing race. And these little details, like the Manticore's row of triple teeth, covering with ears when sleeping, or the molting of hair, they're fantasy, all right. But you see, they're not just form-based fantasy. So it's not just a man with a dog's head or whatever, but they describe behavior and growth and these details, and they really add a flavor to these fantastic creatures, and they make them feel more real. So when you're designing your own fictional races or speculative zoology creatures or whatever, always remember the shape and the form is only one aspect, but you can have really memorable details in behavior or ontogeny or culture. Never forget this. And then he describes, Ctesias goes on to describe wild asses the size of horses with purple heads and blue eyes. I don't know, maybe these are oxes. And then most fantastically, worms like those that attack fig trees, but 7 cubits long and so thick that a child of 10 can scarcely put its arms around one. So giant worms that graze on the trees like serpentine sauropods or something really bizarre. And how did they measure, like, which kid went on to hug the worm to cite this measurement? I don't know. But yeah, then this is Ctesias basically. You can search for it. I think Ctesias, that's Ctesias, no, Ctesias, and the book is called Indica, and I think you can find free copies online. This is really great. I think this is a kind of fiction that's dead in this day and age. Guy just describes the world non-stop and doesn't care for stories, doesn't care for character arcs, doesn't even care too much for world building, but mixes it up with these images, behaviors, and other cultural details with such a kind of skilled spickling. Oops, my wife is calling. Yes, you are on air on CM Kosemen podcast, cast. Our guest is calling. What?
I have a question.
Huh?
May I please ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so my question is, when are you going to be in Ullus? Because I assume we're going to go for walking. Huh?
Right. Your husband will be home. I wish you hadn't mentioned the neighborhood. Very, very, very soon. I'm just describing these amazing legends in the past. Yes, you're live. You're being recorded at the moment.
Could you please delete this message?
What has been recorded cannot be deleted.
Oh no, oh no.
Okay. Okay, honey,
Alright.
I'll be back soon.
Okay, no problem. I love you. Bye-bye.
I love you too. Times like this and a wife like this. Let's knock on wood. Okay, what was I saying? So, yeah, this kind of speculative fiction. No story, no world building, no morals, no metaphors of character building or characters' feelings or whatever, but no, just building a world on and on and on. Motherfucker just lays it down there, and they speculate with such a nice mixture of description, legend, and these little details that these are like kernels of salt dropped into a supersaturated solution. And like the crystals growing in a supersaturated solution, this is a physics experiment reference, like the growth of those crystals in our minds, this endless and bizarre world takes shapes, and no one can do it like these old geniuses. Today, world building is always chained to these stories we invent or other things like metaphors and whatever. I mean, you could see it in other details that Ctesias is giving. For example, he also describes landscapes and rivers and things. For example, there are rivers that are so good that they cure leprosy, rivers that flow with honey and amber, and actually these motifs feature strongly in the descriptions of heaven in one of the major world's religion in this day and age. So guess who copied from who, but whatever. For example, another river, according to Ctesias, has water which sets like cheese and it flows slowly. And then in another river, some legendary stone called the Panhard Stone is found, and it glows in the dark. And what is this Panhard Stone? It's spelled Pantarbe. Is it radium or something else? Probably some scholars already have answered this question, but I don't know the answer, so I'm just asking. And also, like, he describes other things like griffins, for example, which we all know what they look like. Four-footed birds the size of a wolf with legs and claws like a lion. The feathers are red on the breast and black on the rest of the body. The cool thing about Ctesias is this, that he gives these color descriptions like one would describe a mundane bird or something. And of course, more about griffins, that there was a pet theory that they were actually based on skulls of the dinosaur Protoceratops that were unearthed in ancient Bactria or China or wherever. Maybe this is true, I don't know. But once again, curious connection nevertheless. Also, like, to finish off with Ctesias, I haven't even gotten to Alexander the Great's narrative. So he really layers these worlds over each other. Like, he describes that he journeyed to the country of the Isedones, which are a kind of Scythian-like group of people, and beyond them lived the one-eyed Arimaspians. Beyond them the Griffins, which guard the gold, and beyond the Griffins, Hyperboreans, who are like basically Atlantis in a northern shore. And I think their life just looks like an Iron Maiden album cover all the time. And of course, this layered approach, like you could build certain portions of the world and then in the rest give just echoes, little references which pile up and phew. Another writer that tells about the distant east and its strange creatures is Megasthenes. That's Megasthenes from the 3rd century BC. And he describes this amazing ants that dig for metal. And he says they are not inferior in size to wild foxes. They run with amazing speed and live by the produce of their chase. So they hunt little animals, but they're ants. Why would somebody imagine this? Anyways, it's been suggested that maybe this was a translation mistake, but I don't know. So the good thing about Megasthenes' giant ants is, once again, he really fleshes out the legend. He doesn't describe a fantastic beast, but he says, for example, if people come openly, the ants attack and pursue them. So to steal their gold, people lay down several pieces of the flesh of wild beasts. And when the ants are distracted, they steal their gold. And then he says things like, the gold dust has to be boiled a little to be cleaned, or little things like this, which really makes it feel like he has seen this practice in action. But let's move on to the major battle itself, the Alexander romance itself. As I told you before, this book exists in several different editions and versions because it was the Middle Ages. There were no printing presses. Copying books invariably meant changing and adding to them. It was a more different, mutation-prone form of book reproduction. But anyways, in the Alexander romance, after Darius is killed in the Persian desert, Alexander and his men go deep into the desert in the direction of the constellation of the Plough, which I think is Pleiades, but I'm not really sure. But here their action begins, First, they encounter giant fleas the size of frogs, and numerous strange races, including men with the faces of lions, giants with hands like saws, and a creature that almost sounds like King Kong. Basically, it's a big hairy man, and he demands naked maidens, and he grabs her and eats her. So this is wow, especially the bit about the saw-handed man. It's just metal to the bone. And then the King Kong creature. It's arguably the first instance where Kong made an appearance in world literature, dare I say. Compare this with the earlier podcast I published, and people asked me what would I do if I had unlimited budget for a King Kong movie, and I actually said something quite like this. It would be an endless battle against strange monsters in a distant land. And then there are more things like, there are, for example, the fish eaters. And they casually say that, they have no heads, and they have their faces in their chests, and they have big ears once more, and they feed on fish, because. And then they encounter another set of adventures where they have man and horse eating ants, pygmies, once again, another giant that eats women, man with 6 hands and 6 feet, and finally dog-headed man, which is a bit of an anticlimax because after 6 hand and 6 feet man, do they have like a total of 12 limbs? Or maybe, I don't know, normal 2 arms, but the 4 arms split into 3, or something else. I don't know. But that's amazing. And then, once again, another adventure. This is not directly from the Alexander romance, but something called the Letter to Aristotle, which is supposedly a letter written by Alexander the Great to his tutor Aristotle, but of course it's not. It's a much later forgery, but the story here is just amazing. So Alexander and his men go through the Caspian Gates, which is somewhere in Central Asia, I guess, and they proceed through sandy wastes led by unreliable guides. Okay, the guides are really kind of shifty people, and they see a river, but the water is undrinkable. But on top of the river, in the middle of the river, there's an island of again Indian reeds, probably bamboo or something, and there's a castle built out of Indian reeds. So it's either a bamboo castle or a like superb organic cobra-la kind of castle made out of banyan trees and figs or something. And then his soldiers try to swim to this island slash organic plant castle, but they're eaten by hippopotami. But these hippopotami are not the hippopotami you and I know, my friend. No, far from it. These are half man and half horse creatures, and they devour the man. So, to punish their shifty guides, Alexander feeds them to the humanoid hippopotami, and then they are devoured by hippopotami, which are so plentiful that they're said to swarm like ants. But then the real magic begins. So the inhabitants of the Fig Island see the commotion, and they appear in a boat, and another guide appears and takes them to a nearby lake of sweet water. And Alexander and his men try to set up camp there. But what they encounter, my friends, is nothing less than a night of terrors. To prove how badass Alexander and his army was, the unknown authors of this letter to Aristotle lists their amazing combat with an unending stream of creatures that are so strange that I'm just going to lay it out for you. When the moon began to rise, scorpions suddenly arrived to drink in the lake, and then there came huge beasts and serpents of various colors, some red, some black, or some white, some gold, and the whole earth echoed with the serpents and their hissing, and it filled them with considerable fear. Can you see how badass this is? The snake upon snake is boiling out of the ground. It was already the 3rd hour of the night, and the ordeals hadn't even begun yet. We were hoping that we should get some sleep when more serpents arrived, but these were not normal. They had crests on their heads, and they were thicker than columns, and their breath and their spit too was poisonous. We spent more than an hour of the night fighting them, as you would. What's this? Oh, it's nothing. It's this cockatrice serpents again, as thick as columns. Okay, let's take an hour cutting them up. Hack, hock, and then they killed our party of 30 servants and 20 soldiers, which gives an idea of the social structure of this time and age. When someone says there were like 20 people in a certain place, you could bet that there were probably 60 people there, because everyone had 3 or 4 servants or slaves, which were not actually counted among the people kind, whatever. But their troubles is not over yet. Far from it. After the serpents had gone away, they arrived crabs with hard backs like those of crocodiles. I think they would make good eating. And then, when we threw our sprayers at them, they did not penetrate. Yet still, we killed a good many of them with fire. Of course, they see if you got giant crabs, you got a giant crab barbecue. Let's have a Barbie. Not penetrating, but just burn them all. Good eating. Servants could have some of them too, I guess. But not too much. Don't want them to get greedy. Anyways, then it's not over yet. Now they've cleared the reptile and invertebrate stage. Okay, so it's the level complete. But next to arrive are white lions, bigger than bulls, followed by giant pigs and huge bats with human teeth. This is amazing. Huge bats, but you would expect them to have snake's teeth or something, but human teeth. This is unbelievable. Letter of Aristotle is a classic of speculative zoology, in my opinion. And any of you listeners, please, if you haven't gotten the idea already, make drawings of these creatures. Huge bats with human teeth. The biggest of the lot was a beast larger than an elephant with 3 horns on its forehead. In the Indian language, it was called Odontotyrannus or Tooth Tyrant. And some of the ancient books actually have an illustration of this Odontotyrannus. And I believe my good friend Emil Makdi, who lives in Lebanon now, I think made a couple of illustrations of these creatures. Odontotyrannus looks like a giant lion the size of a rhino with a kind of head like an orca, and an enormous narwhal-like horn grows from it. And there's 2 other horns or ears, I don't know. But it's bizarre. And then this is basically the big boss of the night, in one night. And I think the white lions are a really cool idea too, in the middle of the night. Phew. And then it killed several dozen Macedonians before Alexander's men were able to overcome it. And before dawn, now the major boss is dead, so smaller bosses are coming, We had to face shrews the size of foxes. Oh my god, with their biddly noses. I bet they would tickle a good many heroes in their armpits with their long noses. But there was actually a 1960s horror film, The Giant Shrews, Attack of the Giant Shrews. And in this movie, they dressed out dogs with like pointy nose plastic things, and supposedly these were the giant shrews. But if I'm not mistaken, this was a British film. So I could really see a kind of Oxford or a Cambridge guy reading Alexander's letter to Aristotle and then passing the idea to a filmmaker friend. Or maybe the filmmakers just, like many people, thought shrews were creepy and wanted to have giant shrews. So, and then finally at dawn, there were giant, bright red vultures with black beaks. And after killing them all, it was a relief to be able to strike camp, tired as we were, and to march onwards. Well, just a average night's work for a Macedonian soldier. I wish someone would make this into an animated movie or something. Really, it would be. You don't even need to give like some guys just fighting animals. It would be cool to watch. And the nice thing about these, once again, is the kind of minimum story and maximum world building and maximum creature overload. All these animals, of course, they serve to highlight how badass the Macedonians were, but they create in our minds a kind of strange ecosystem for this bizarre land, and you wonder what else could be lurking out there. By the way, if you're thinking about Odontotyrannus, also please check the illustrations made by a certain Frida Ulrika Nyberg. She's known as Zanizaila on DeviantArt, and she's some pretty good artwork too. It's Zanizaila at DeviantArt. Amazing artwork. And she imagines all this Odontotyrannus or various dragons and everything else as if they were realistic animals, and it's a really good article in my opinion. Okay, I said no pictures, but here's a picture of the Odontotyrannus from the Alexander Romance. Are you ready? Okay. So this is Alexander the Great and his amazing world of creatures and world building. The biggest takeaway you should have from this is the endless possibilities offered by this sort of non-narrative, non-linear, just creature upon creature kind of world building type, which no longer seems to exist. Maybe it does exist. I mean, one could look at the Speculative Dinosaur Project or My Sniad as examples of this kind of no story but just creatures type of world building. But anyways, this book is great. The book's title, Alexander the Great, A Life in Legend. And you could find also the Alexander Romance online and PDF format. Read them all. I think they really expand your horizons. If you're coming from the more science, paleontology, movies, popular sci-fi kind of world, it's very rewarding to expand into this kind of world of classical literature, and you'll run into surprises in every corner. And then there's also some other really poignant things about the Alexander legend. He and his adventures inspired so many people, even in recent times, especially in Britain. The Brits were so inspired by classic lore that many of them turned to this romanticized love life of Alexander the Great to reflect their own views on tragic romances. And one poet named James Elroy Flecker has an amazing poem named Santorin, and it's about Alexander the Great. And obviously in legend, Alexander was such a badass that when he wasn't killing 10 different clades of monsters every night, he was making love to all kinds of sexy, sultry, and traumatic oriental women, and they all fell for them. One of them is named Candace, which is a kind of Protean, oriental, like there's parts of Cleopatra, Queen of Sheba, Semiramis, all kinds of literary idols in her. But this one poet, James Elroy Flecker, writes in a passage called The Mermaids, "Who are you, sea lady? And where in the seas are we? How should I know your lover, lady of the sea?" And Lady of the Sea answers, "Alexander, Alexander, king of the world was he. His mother was the foam-foot, star-sprangling Aphrodite. His father Adonis, who lived away in far-off Lebanon. But where is Alexander, my soldier Alexander, my golden love of olden days, the king of the world and me?" It's just so... the mermaid, or whoever she is really... we all miss some people this way. And another pattern repeated in the writings of another British scholar is that of Patrick Leigh Fermor. So he's a traveler to Greece in the 20s and 30s, so not very old. But he recounts this tragic legend of mermaids among the fishermen of Greece. So he says, "In these waters, beautiful solitary gorgons suddenly surface in the hurly-burly of a cyclodic or Euxine storm, especially for some reason on Saturday nights. They grasp the boats and ask the captain in ringing tones, 'Where is Alexander the Great?' the crazy sea woman asks. And of course to this the captain must answer at the top of his voice, 'Alexander the Great lives and reigns, even though if it's 1930. You must say this, or the crazy and beautiful Gorgon mermaid will sink your ship, because she's just whack, and that's just how she rolls.'" Strange things love can lead a person into. But funnily again, this is being recorded on 30th of March 2017, and I read something today that today was International Bipolar Disorder or Borderline Disorder Awareness Day. I'm really not making this up. So there is something like this today, and now I'm reading about all these crazy mermaids who's like, "Where's my boyfriend? Or I will kill you," or something like that. But anyways, Alexander the Great, cool story, world builder, inadvertently, but world builder, snake slayer, mermaid lover, all around badass guy. Look more into classical history and you will find many things. Oh, phone ringing again. You are on CM Kosemen podcasts again, and we're almost finished recording. Do you want to listen to a song about Alexander the Great? Here, let me sing it to you. Oh, my son, find for yourself another kingdom, for that which I leave is too small for you. Near to the east, in the heart of ancient Greece, in a distant land called Macedonia, which didn't have anything to do with the province of Greece known as Macedonia, or the country that the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia was born a son to Philip of Macedon. The legend, his name was Alexander. Alexander the Great became a legend back was a man. Iron Maiden. It's really great. Okay, listeners, my wife is calling. I need to go. Yeah, I was just about to finish anyways. Alexander the Great was really badass. And if you're interested in world building, you should get out of the comfort space of science fiction, science, and paleontology. And just like the way Alexander ventured into the wider world, let's get out of our comfort zone and explore other areas like classical literature, world literature, legends, and there will always be more monsters for us to face and more things to feed our intellect. Thanks. This is CM Kosemen. I'm signing off. Do you want to say anything?
No.
Really? Yeah. Hi, I'm signing off now. I love you.
I love you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.